Greetings and welcome. My name is Aaron Craig with Let's Learn This Together. When you're making a game, oftentimes you will encounter problems. Sometimes these problems are ones that you create by the code you put in there, and sometimes they are accidental and you have no idea what's going on. So I'm going to be showing you how to debug both using the built-in debugger and just using some logic that we can get from as we test out our project. This is the Create and Change Rooms project that you may have already seen on my channel. I've made several alterations, maybe several mistakes that newbies would make, and sometimes even veterans, as you are making a game. So let's just go ahead and run the project, and as we come across a problem, I'm just going to solve it, and I'm going to talk about it, how I figured it out, and show you the tools that I use. So all this project does is move from one room to another, but even in that small instance, you can have a lot of problems. So if I go over here, I should warp, but I don't. So what happens when I try to warp is I get an error and the game will crash. Now this error is really important because it actually tells you where it happens, the exact line it happens, and why it's happening. So let's read this together. Variable obj warp, so I have an object called obj warp2, dot y position, not set before reading it. So the error is that a variable that I'm trying to access in this object isn't set. So let's go down to the object in question and take a look. When a variable isn't set, it doesn't have a value. And if it doesn't have a value, you can't pull data from it. So the y position is the variable that did not have a value. So if we bring up the output, we can scroll up and actually see this same error again. It's also put right here. So on line 8, this is the problem. And there's even a warning here that variable y position is only referenced once. So this variable is not being used correctly. Like there's no value associated with it. So when we say it's new y is equal to that, it crashes because it can't be equal to nothing. Well, sometimes you can be, okay, you can be equal to undefined or null or nil, depending on the language you're using, but an undefined variable isn't nothing, it doesn't exist. And you can't pull a value that doesn't exist, like it doesn't know. So let's take a look, and in our variable definitions is where it should be set. But if we look at y position, if I copy this and I put it here, well, now that works and you can see the problem. This P is not capitalized. So I'm going to capitalize it here and then capitalize it here, and that will take the error away. Eventually. Sometimes it takes a little while of moving things around. I'll run the project, and there it goes. Now, we still have one right there, so I'm going to minimize this before we try playing it again, because this variable, room name, is only referenced once. Now, I've got it right here, and oh, look at that. I'm missing an E. So now, it's actually the same name. Let's run it again, and let's try warping into the next room. Okay, we have another error as we tried to warp into the next room. The new y not set before reading it, and this time it's in the warp controller, line 7, step event. So let's go over there. Now we've seen this before. This is only referenced once. Let's go to the create event. New y is supposed to be with a capital Y, and this one is not. So let's fix that. And if we come back over here, new x has the same problem. Okay. Now, those are done. Let's try this again. Those are the obvious ones. When you see that yellow sign, it means that you're trying to access something that doesn't exist, so it's going to crash. Those ones are fairly easy to fix. These ones are a little bit trickier. So what's going on here? Well, this is not where I'm supposed to be. If we look at our rooms, room next is over, oh, well, look at that. Okay, so I'm supposed to spawn in right here, but I'm actually spawning in here because there's another instance of my character, OBJ Skelly. So I only want to have one of them. If there's a second one, then GameMaker doesn't know which one to actually control or to put the camera on. So let's try that again. There should only be one instance of your player ever as it's moving between rooms. So let's go over here. Now there's no warp coming up, and now there's nothing over here either. Okay. So something is wrong. So first, let's take a look at what's happening with the warp. So if we go to our warp controller, this should actually be creating a fade between the rooms. In our step event, you can see here that the fade level increases, and then when it's less than 0, it's destroyed. So it goes from one side to the other, but right now nothing is happening. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint right here. You can add a breakpoint by clicking to the left of the number or by pressing F9, and that will take it away if there already is one there. So I'm going to add a breakpoint here, and then you can use the debugger, or run the debug right here by F6 or this little icon, and this is going to pop up a new window, kind of a new area that you may not have seen before. But the debugger is one of the most valuable tools that you can have in your arsenal. I use this all the time. So let's go through a quick breakthrough of what we're looking at inside of the window, or the area, the workspace called Debugger. I'm going to minimize this. So we have a graph over here showing our FPS. You can see that it's kind of all over the place, but it gives you an average and how much memory you're using. Then you can see all of the objects that you have available and all the rooms here. You have more tabs down here as well called variables, instances, others, and graphics. The ones we're going to be sticking to are variables and instances. So instances are the actual objects inside of your room. You can see we have a skeleton and a warp 2 object. So these we can actually click on and we can see all this data. Now skeleton doesn't really have any data and warp 2 has a few variables here. If you're not seeing any of this, you may need to have the enable real-time debugging clicked. If this isn't on, then it may not be working. So that's how you can view all the objects. The controls up here are to pause your game. And when you pause it, it actually shows you exactly which line that the game is running on. You can then start it, you can restart the game or stop it. And then these three right here, they're kind of confusing, but essentially it will move you through the next line of code. And this is actually a great example to show all three of them. So this first one is to step into the function call. And that means that it's actually going to move down the next line wherever that line is at. So if I press here, it's going to go down into this next bracket, and then it's going to check this. Now that's not there, and we don't have any of those, so that's all done. So we move on to the next thing, and this step event is actually the only thing that's running. So we're not going anywhere else. But if we wanted to skip over, say, one bracket, we could click on step over a function call, and then it wouldn't actually go inside of it. And if we wanted to get out of the function completely, like out of an entire event, you can click this one and it would just go on to the next event. Now we only have one, so it's not really doing much. But if I come down here and do that, where I'm actually going is at the top of the if statement where we are. Okay, I'm going to click start. Let's try going through this warp again. So as soon as we get to here, as soon as this line of code runs, our breakpoint stops it and loads up the debugger. And now we can go through here and look at all of the data associated with this object. So our fade level is being increased, okay? Fade level is not greater than 1, so that's not going to activate. Even though it kind of showed that it did, it was actually on the last line here. It wasn't setting our Y right there. So let's continue. Nope, so I'm going to just move out of this, move out of that, move down here. So fade level is 0.13. So our fade level is increasing, and that means that we should actually be able to see a black thing start to appear in our game. Now, when your game is paused in the debugger, a lot of times you can't actually see, it's just a white screen. If I press play again, it'll come up, and you can press play again and again to see what's going on. My fade level is not very high right now, so I'll press play many more times. So it's at 25%, and at this point I should be able to see something, and I still can't. So let's take a look at the built-in variables of our instance here. And the instance is obj warp controller. You can see that that's where it shows here. So if I exit out of this, and then I come into this code, you can see that over here, skeleton now has the step event highlighted. But I want to be inside of the warp controller. So I'm going to look at the built-in variables. Now, when something is not showing up where you expect it, what I first check is the X and Y. So X and Y here, -43 and 112. I can see exactly where this object is supposed to be at in my room. This is really helpful when you create something and then it's not there. Well, if the X and Y is where it's supposed to be, then that object is there and you have to look for something else. Another option here would be, is it visible? Now, looking through here, it can be really hard to find it, but here's visible. Visible is 1, which is true, so this object should be visible. I'm going to click on name to sort these by name, which will really help as well. We can locate them a lot easier, I think. The layer. Okay, so here's an interesting tidbit. If layer is -1, that means it isn't on a layer. So if we go to room next, we've got 3 layers here. And the instances layer has a depth of 0. This has a depth of 100, and this has a depth of 200. Now, we know that we're not on a layer because it's -1. If it was another number, it would actually show you which layer it was on. And we can actually take a look at that by going back to the debugger. Let's go to instances over here, skeleton, and let's take a look at the layer that skeleton is on. It's on 3, so that's on a correct layer. So if our warp is not on a layer, that means we created it instead. Let's see, warp 2 is where we create it. We actually created it in depth, and that means that it's not on a layer, which is fine. That's what we wanted. But let's take a look at the other property which causes a lot of issues, is our depth. So this right here has a depth of 1000. Now, in your rooms, the lower a depth is, the closer to the screen it is, which means that a depth of 100 for tiles means it's behind my player. If I put the tiles in front, well, they're actually going to cover up the player, which you can kind of see right there. This is now in front, and that's not what we want. If we did the background, it would actually completely take over the player and everything else. So if our warp object has a depth of 1000, that means that it's all the way even behind our background, so it's never going to show up. So let's cancel the debugger and get rid of all these extra things. Go back to our workspace, and we can take a look at this. This is creating at depth plus 1000. We needed it at depth minus 1000. That way it is always in front of everything in our room. Okay, let's try this one more time. There's our fade. Awesome. But now we have nothing over here. Okay. So I'm going to open up again. Let's go down here. I'm going to take this out. What I want to do is actually put a breakpoint right here. Run the debugger, because this will trigger the breakpoint when we are in the new room and the fade destroys itself. So we can look to see where our skeleton is at in the new room. Okay. Now if we look at instances, well, our skeleton object is not here. It doesn't exist. This holds every single instance in this room, and it's not here. If an instance isn't here, well, it somehow got destroyed or it never got sent over. So look at that. This wasn't set to persistent. If it's not clicked, then it's going to stay in the room it started in. All right. Let's see if that's the last thing. I'm just going to run it regularly. No debugger this time around. There's our fade, and voila. That's it. So that fixed all of the issues that are pretty common when working at least with this project, and a lot of times all of your projects. And I can't stress enough how useful the debugger is. Knowing how to add a breakpoint, press F6 or this little bug icon and run your game and be able to look at all of the data that you need to be able to see. I use this probably more often than I actually add code, if I'm being honest. Because every time you add code, and as your game gets larger, more and more objects are going to interact and more bugs will appear. So knowing how to get in and out of the debugger, how to view all the instances, how to view the specific instance. This actually shows local variables too, which is really helpful. All of this is so useful. Variables over here has global variables as well, which is great. You can see exactly what's calling what and where the code is at. You can walk through the code one line at a time. It's all incredibly helpful and useful. Something that I use and every coder for every project ever uses. And when GameMaker upgraded their debugger a couple years ago, when they upgraded, I think, to 2.0, it was a huge leap because this debugger is very similar to all of the other debuggers you'll actually use out there. I make websites and mobile apps, and the debugger in GameMaker is similar enough that I can just pull up the debugger in any of them, and I know how to use them because I spent so much time in the GameMaker's debugger. But that's what I've got for you. Hopefully this helped, and you're now able to go out, debug your own programs, and figure out exactly what's causing you issues in your projects. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later. A huge thank you to all of the awesome people who support me over on Patreon. Their names are on the screen now, and every dollar pledged helps me create more awesome content. You can support me for as little as $1 a month and get access to exclusive perks like my Discord server, your name in the credits, early access to my YouTube videos and courses, and more. Check it out at patreon.com/letslearnthistogether.com or find the link in the description below and become a patron today.